Town sent Unwanted Maiden to Mountain Man's cabin. What he saw in her changed everything. The town of Millstone was small and quiet, tucked between rolling hills and thick forests. Life there moved slowly, like the creek that ran through the center of town. People knew each other's business, often too well. Gossip traveled faster than the wind, and anyone who did not follow the unspoken rules quickly found themselves on the edge. Clara Benson had always known that feeling. Clara was a young woman of 18, with soft brown hair that fell in gentle waves around her shoulders, and eyes that reflected more thoughtfulness than most her age. She had always been different, quiet, careful, and more curious about the woods and the river than about the chatter of the marketplace. Some of the townsfolk found her odd. Others thought she was trouble. Her family, once well-respected, had fallen on hard times, and whispers of scandal had followed her like shadows. Though Clara had done nothing wrong, the weight of rumors and misjudgments pressed heavily on her shoulders. It was on a crisp autumn morning when her father called her into the dimly lit kitchen. The smell of fried bread and strong coffee filled the small room. Clara noticed the weariness in his eyes, a mixture of guilt and resolve. "Clara," he said, his voice low and hesitant, "the town, they think it's best for you to stay with Elias Monroe." Clara's heart skipped. Elias Monroe, the mountain man, was a figure of mystery and fear in Millstone. No one had seen him often, and those who did spoke in hushed tones. He lived alone, far in the mountains, in a cabin that seemed part of the forest itself. Stories of his rough temper and harsh life had circulated for years, exaggerated with each telling. Children were warned never to wander near his home. Adults whispered about the tragedies in his past. Now Clara was being sent there, exiled from the only place she had ever called home. Her father's hand trembled as he held hers. "I know it's not what you want, Clara," he said. "But the town believes this is the only way to keep you safe and to give you a chance at a new start." His words were meant to comfort, but they felt like chains. Clara wanted to argue, to tell him she could handle herself, that she did not need to be sent away. But the weight of the town's judgment made her silent. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The journey began at sunrise. Clara packed a small bag with the essentials, a few clothes, a loaf of bread, and her father's old knife, which she clutched tightly. The townspeople watched from a distance as she left, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Some shook their heads, muttering about the trouble she had brought. Others whispered that perhaps Elias Monroe could teach her humility, or maybe even break her spirit. Clara did not know what awaited her, only that the path ahead was uncertain and frightening. The road to the mountains was long and winding. It climbed steep slopes, twisted around ancient trees, and followed narrow streams that glittered in the morning sun. Clara walked carefully, feeling the muscles in her legs grow tired with each step. The forest was alive with sounds, birds calling from the treetops, leaves rustling in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. She had always loved nature, but today it felt like both a friend and a challenge. Every shadow seemed larger, every rustle sharper. The further she walked, the more isolated she felt, as if the world she knew had been left far behind. As the sun climbed higher, Clara's mind wandered. She thought about the life she had known, the streets of Millstone, the small bakery where she had worked, and the friends she had lost. Her mother had passed away when she was young, leaving her with memories of soft lullabies and warm smiles. Her father had tried his best to care for her, but life had become harder with each passing year. And now all those familiar comforts were slipping away, replaced by uncertainty and fear. By late afternoon, the dense forest opened slightly, revealing the first view of the mountains. They rose like jagged giants, covered in thick pine and oak, their peaks shrouded in mist. Clara paused, her breath catching. The mountains were beautiful, but also intimidating, vast and untamed. Somewhere in that wilderness was Elias Monroe's cabin. Somewhere in that solitude she would have to survive. As she continued, the path grew steeper and narrower. Rocks jutted out from the ground and tree roots snaked across the trail. Clara stumbled a few times, scraping her hands and knees, but she refused to give up. She thought of the town's words, the rumors, the judgment, and she felt a spark of determination. She would not be broken by whispers. She would face this challenge, whatever it might be. Hours later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Clara finally saw it. A small cabin nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, hinting at a warm fire inside. The cabin was simple, made of weathered logs with a small porch and a sturdy wooden door. It looked both welcoming and foreboding, a place that could offer shelter but demanded respect. She approached cautiously, unsure of what awaited. The door creaked open and a tall figure emerged, Elias Monroe. He was older than she had imagined, with deep lines etched into his face and hair as dark as the forest shadows. His eyes were sharp, wary, and unreadable. He wore simple, rugged clothes and carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had lived through hardship. "Clara Benson," he said, his voice low and steady. "The town sends you?" He didn't smile, didn't offer a handshake, only studied her carefully. Clara nodded, her throat tight, and held out her small bag. He took it wordlessly, setting it aside before turning toward the cabin. Life in the cabin began with silence. Elias had his routines, precise and unyielding. Clara quickly realized that survival in the mountains was not easy. She chopped wood for the fire, carried water from the stream, and helped prepare simple meals. Every day was a test of endurance, patience, and courage. The forest was beautiful but unforgiving. Wolves howled in the distance at night, the wind cut through the trees, and the cold seeped into her bones. At first, Clara struggled. Her hands blistered, her muscles ached, and she often doubted herself. Elias offered no praise, no comfort, only quiet instruction, expecting her to learn quickly. It was humbling, even frightening. She remembered the townspeople who had called her weak and useless. Here in the mountains, those words seemed almost true. But Clara was not ready to give up. Each day, she learned something new. How to read the signs of the forest where the berries were safe to eat, how to stack wood for the night, and how to move quietly so as not to startle the animals. She began to see the forest not as a prison, but as a teacher, harsh but fair. Elias watched her progress, noting her determination and quiet strength. He was still reserved, still cautious, but he began to see that Clara was not like the townspeople had said. She had courage, patience, and intelligence, qualities that could survive in this wild place. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to respect her. Evenings were the hardest. The silence of the mountains pressed in, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Clara often sat on the porch, looking at the stars, feeling the vastness of the world around her. Memories of home came to her, and sometimes tears would fall. She missed her father, the bakery, and the simple warmth of her old life. But she also felt something new, a quiet sense of independence, a realization that she could face challenges she had never imagined. The first weeks were full of small victories and setbacks. She learned to chop wood without hurting herself, to cook simple meals, and to carry water without spilling it. Elias occasionally offered a nod of approval, a rare smile, small gestures that told her she was earning his respect. Clara realized that the mountain, harsh as it was changing her. She was stronger, more capable, and more confident than she had been when she left Millstone. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara looked out at the setting sun and felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She thought of the town that had sent her away, of the whispers that had followed her for years, and she realized that she no longer cared what they thought. Here in the mountains, she was learning her own strength. She was discovering who she could be beyond the judgment and gossip of others. And so, Clara's exile became the beginning of something unexpected. The journey that had started in fear and shame was slowly turning into a story of courage, resilience, and transformation. The mountains were harsh, but they were honest. And in that honesty, Clara began to see that perhaps this forced journey could lead her not only to survival, but to something far greater: self-discovery, independence, and the chance to redefine herself on her own terms. By the time the first snow dusted the mountain tops, Clara was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived from Millstone. She was stronger, wiser, and more aware of her own abilities. Elias, still quiet and reserved, began to show signs that he too was noticing her change. The girl who had been sent away as a burden was slowly proving that she could thrive, even in the most unforgiving of places. And so, the first chapter of Clara's life in the mountains ended not with despair, but with a cautious hope. The beginning of a journey that would test her, challenge her, and ultimately reveal the strength that had always been inside her. The days in the mountains passed slowly, yet swiftly, as Clara settled into the rhythm of her new life. She had grown stronger, her hands calloused from chopping wood and drawing water from the cold stream that ran near Elias Monroe's cabin. Yet even as she learned the ways of the forest, she could not shake the unease that lingered around Elias. He was a man of few words, each carefully chosen, each measured. His silence often weighed on her more than the biting wind or the rough work outside. Clara had started to notice patterns in his behavior. Elias woke before dawn, fetching water, tending the fire, and preparing for the day. He moved through the forest with ease, seemingly at one with the towering pines, the hidden trails, and the creatures that stirred in the underbrush. He taught Clara how to track animals by the marks they left, how to find edible roots and berries without fear, and how to listen to the wind for signs of changing weather. At first, Clara felt clumsy and overwhelmed. Her hands fumbled when trying to make traps, her legs ached from long hikes, and her mind raced with doubts. But slowly, she improved, learning not just survival skills, but the patience and observation required to thrive in such isolation. One crisp morning, Elias handed her a small hand-forged knife, the handle worn smooth from years of use. "You'll need this," he said, his voice rough yet not unkind. "Be careful." "Respect it." Clara took it, running her fingers along the blade, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. It was more than a tool, it was a test. And though she felt fear at the thought of misusing it, she also felt a surge of pride. She was learning, adapting, surviving. Despite the harsh routines, Clara found small joys. She would watch the sun rise over the mountains, painting the forest in golden light, or marvel at the deer that grazed quietly near the clearing. She learned to identify birds by their songs, to tell the difference between edible mushrooms and poisonous ones, and to move silently so as not to startle the wildlife. Slowly, the mountains began to feel less like a prison and more like a home, though a wild and demanding one. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface. Elias remained distant, his approval rare and his praise almost non-existent. Clara often wondered if he believed she could truly survive here, if he saw her as capable or merely tolerated her presence. One afternoon, after a long day of hauling firewood and mending the cabin roof, she finally broke the silence. "Elias, do you think I can really do this?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. He paused, leaning on the hammer in his hands, his gaze fixed on the forest beyond the clearing. "Do this, survive, that's not a question I can answer for you," he said. "You either can or you can't, the forest doesn't lie." Clara frowned. "But you've seen me." "You know I'm learning, don't you?" Elias studied her, his eyes shadowed and thoughtful. Finally, he nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes, you're learning, but learning is not enough. You must be ready when the unexpected comes. The forest, it doesn't forgive mistakes." Clara felt a chill, but also a spark of determination. She realized that Elias was not trying to be cruel, he was preparing her for reality. She resolved to do better, to be ready for whatever challenges the mountain could throw at her. The first real test came sooner than she expected. One morning, as Clara and Elias walked along a narrow trail to check traps, the ground beneath Elias shifted. A loose rock tumbled, catching his foot and sending him sprawling down a small slope. Clara gasped, her heart hammering in her chest. Without thinking, she sprinted after him, grabbing his arm as he tried to steady himself. Together, they managed to climb back to solid ground. Elias looked at her, his eyes wide, not with anger but with surprise. You didn't freeze," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Most would have panicked." Clara felt her cheeks flush. "I didn't want to see you hurt," she admitted. I could help." For the first time, Elias seemed to soften. He studied her carefully, as though seeing her for the first time, not as the town's exiled girl, but as someone who had courage and quick thinking. "You saved me," he said simply, the words almost strange in his mouth. Clara realized that he did not offer praise easily, yet these words carried weight far beyond any compliment she had ever received. After that day, their relationship shifted. Clara felt a quiet confidence growing within her, and Elias began to trust her with more responsibility. He taught her how to set more complex traps, how to find safe water, and how to recognize the subtle signs of approaching storms. Each lesson was a challenge, pushing her to think, act, and adapt. And each success built her sense of self, transforming her from a frightened girl into a capable young woman. But the mountain was not just a place of physical challenges. It was also a place of reflection and emotion. One evening, after a long day of clearing paths near the cabin, Clara and Elias sat by the fire, the flames dancing across their faces. For the first time, he spoke about his past. "My wife and my son," Elias began, his voice low and distant. They didn't survive the winter many years ago. I couldn't bear to stay in town after that. Too many memories, too many people asking questions I couldn't answer." He paused, staring into the fire. "So I came here, I live alone, I survive. The forest, it doesn't ask questions, it doesn't judge, it just is." Clara listened quietly, feeling a mix of sadness and understanding. She realized that Elia's distance was not cruelty, but protection, a shield against pain he had endured. And in that moment she felt a connection, a shared understanding that went beyond words. She too had been judged unfairly, misunderstood, and cast aside. Yet here in the mountains, they were both finding ways to survive, to heal, to grow. Days turned into weeks, and Clara's skills continued to improve. She learned to identify subtle changes in the weather, to recognize the tracks of different animals, and to move silently through the undergrowth. She even began to anticipate Elia's movements, knowing when he would need help before he asked. Their work together became a quiet partnership, built on mutual respect rather than words. One afternoon, a sudden storm swept through the mountains. The wind howled through the trees and rain pelted down in sheets. Clara and Elias worked together to secure the cabin, tying down loose shingles and covering the firewood. The storm raged for hours, and Clara felt fear creep in despite her growing confidence. Yet, side by side with Elias, she discovered a new strength within herself. She could face the storm not as a frightened girl, but as someone who had learned to endure and adapt. After the storm passed, the forest seemed renewed, the air crisp and clean. Clara and Elias stepped outside, surveying the landscape. Puddles reflected the sky, and the trees glistened with droplets of rain. Elias gave her a small nod, almost imperceptible, and Clara felt a surge of pride. They had weathered the storm together, both literally and figuratively, and she felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had known in Millstone. Yet, life in the mountains was not without its quiet tensions. Clara sometimes felt lonely, missing the familiar faces of her old life. She wondered if she would ever return to Millstone, and if the townspeople would recognize the young woman she was becoming. But she also understood that her transformation was happening here, far from their judgments and whispers. The forest, harsh and demanding, was teaching her lessons that no town could offer. Elias, too, seemed to change. He remained reserved, but his respect for Clara grew. He began to involve her more in decisions, asking her opinion on the placement of traps or the repair of the cabin. He shared small stories of his past, his voice softening with time. And though he never admitted it outright, Clara sensed that he had come to value her presence, her courage, and her determination. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Clara sat on the porch, watching the mountains stretch into the distance. She thought about how far she had come, from a frightened girl sent away by the town, to someone who could face the challenges of the forest with skill and courage. She realized that the mountains had changed her, shaping her into a person she had not known she could be. And yet she also knew that the journey was far from over. The forest still held dangers, and Elias still guarded his heart carefully. But for the first time, Clara felt a sense of possibility, a quiet hope that she could not only survive but thrive in this place. The mountains had tested her, challenged her, and pushed her to her limits. And in doing so, they had shown her a strength she had never imagined. As night fell, Clara and Elias sat by the fire in companionable silence. The stars emerged, bright and distant, and the forest settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara felt a sense of peace, knowing that she was no longer alone, that she had someone who trusted her, and that she was becoming someone strong and capable. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was ready to face it, step by step, day by day. In the mountains, amidst the towering pines and whispering winds, Clara discovered something precious. Courage born from struggle, strength born from hardship, and a bond formed in the quiet understanding of shared survival. The girl who had arrived in fear and shame was slowly transforming, and even Elias, the mountain man who had lived alone for so long, was beginning to see her in a new light. The forest, once intimidating and wild, had become a place of learning, of growth, and of discovery. And for Clara, the mountain was no longer a place of exile, but a place where her true self could begin to emerge. Months had passed since Clara Benson first arrived at the cabin in the mountains. The girl who had once walked timidly along the forest paths, unsure of her own strength, had changed in ways even she could hardly recognize. Her hair, once neatly tied back, now fell in loose, practical waves that framed her sun-kissed face. Her hands were calloused, and her body was strong from days spent chopping wood, gathering water, and walking the rugged trails. But beyond the physical changes, something deeper had shifted. Clara's mind was sharper, her judgment quicker, and her confidence steadier. She had learned not just to survive, but to thrive. Elias Monroe observed these changes silently, as he often did. He had spent years living alone in the forest, trusting no one, speaking little. Yet Clara's presence had begun to affect him in ways he had not anticipated. He found himself speaking more, giving instruction, and even sharing fragments of his past. Slowly, he had begun to see Clara not as the unwanted maiden the town had sent, but as someone strong, capable, and resilient. And yet he maintained a cautious distance, aware of the trust that needed to grow naturally between them. One morning, Clara woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the cabin window. The wind rustled the pine trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant rain. Today was different. She felt a quiet anticipation, a sense that the day held more than the usual routine. After breakfast, Elias handed her a pack. "We're going further today," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that told Clara this was no ordinary journey. "The forest has more to teach you. You need to be ready for challenges you haven't faced yet." Clara nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. She had grown used to the woods near the cabin, but venturing deeper into unknown terrain would test her skills and her courage. She packed essentials: water, dried food, her small knife, and a blanket. Elias checked her pack with a critical eye, adjusting straps and ensuring she was prepared. "Don't rely on luck," he warned. "Rely on what you know, trust your senses." They set off, moving quietly through the dense forest. Clara had learned to follow Elias' lead, matching his pace, noting the subtle signs of wildlife, listening for the slightest change in the wind or the distant call of a bird. The deeper they went, the more isolated they became. The familiar paths faded, replaced by uneven ground, fallen logs, and steep inclines. Clara's legs ached and sweat dotted her forehead, but she pressed on, determined not to falter. Hours passed, and the sun climbed high. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the underbrush. Elias froze, his body tense. Clara instinctively crouched low, her eyes scanning the area. Out of the foliage stepped a small deer, its wide eyes reflecting fear. Elias exhaled slowly. "Good," he said, a rare note of approval in his voice. "You saw it, you stayed calm." That is the difference between panicking and surviving. Clara smiled faintly, feeling a quiet pride. Moments like these reminded her how far she had come. She no longer relied solely on Elias for guidance. She trusted her own instincts, her own judgment. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced her sense of independence. As they continued, they came upon a narrow cliffside trail overlooking a deep valley blanketed in mist. The sight took Clara's breath away. She paused, mesmerized by the view. Elias watched her silently, and for a moment the distance between them seemed smaller. He had always been part of the mountains, and now she was becoming part of them too. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the valley. A large branch had fallen from an old tree, blocking their path. Elias examined it carefully. "We'll need to climb around," he said. Clara followed his lead, using her strength and agility to navigate the slippery rocks and uneven ground. She felt fear at times, but she also felt exhilaration. Each obstacle was a test, and she met it with determination. By late afternoon, they reached a hidden grove, a place Elias rarely visited. A small stream trickled through the center, surrounded by moss-covered rocks and ancient trees. Elias knelt by the water, filling their canteens. Clara sat nearby, taking in the beauty and stillness of the grove. It was a stark contrast to the harshness of the mountain trails, a reminder that even in the wildest places, moments of peace existed. Elias broke the silence. "This is one of the few places I trust," he said, his voice quiet. "It is protected, hidden. It reminds me why I came here, why I stay." Clara looked at him, noticing the rare vulnerability in his expression. She realized that the man she had first feared carried deep wounds, shaped by loss and solitude. And now, through their shared journey, a bond was forming between them, built on trust, respect, and the challenges they faced together. Over the next few weeks, Clara's abilities grew. She learned to anticipate weather changes, track animals for food, and use the terrain to her advantage. Elias allowed her to take on more responsibility around the cabin. She gathered firewood without prompting, prepared meals, and even began to repair parts of the cabin on her own. Her confidence soared, and with it, her sense of self-worth. One day, Elias challenged her in a way that tested not just her physical abilities, but her judgment. "We need to cross the ridge," he said. "It is steep and dangerous, but it will teach you to trust yourself. I will follow, but you lead the way." Clara felt a surge of fear. The ridge was treacherous with loose stones and sheer drops. Yet she remembered Elia's lessons: trust her instincts, move carefully, observe, and adapt. She began the climb, her movements deliberate and steady. Each step required focus and balance. Elias followed closely, watching, silent but attentive. Clara's heart pounded, but she pushed through the fear. As she reached the top, she looked down at the valley below, feeling a sense of triumph and exhilaration. Elias nodded, the first true smile she had seen on his face in months appearing briefly. "You did well," he said. "Better than I expected." Clara felt a warmth in her chest, not from the sun, but from pride. She had faced the challenge, and she had succeeded. This small acknowledgement from Elias meant more than words could express. The bond between them deepened in ways neither expected. They shared stories around the fire at night. Elias spoke of his wife and child, the pain that had driven him to the mountains, and the lessons he had learned from solitude. Clara spoke of Millstone, her family, and the judgment she had endured. Through these conversations, they discovered mutual understanding, recognizing in each other resilience and courage that had been forged in hardship. One evening, as snow began to dust the mountaintops, Clara and Elias faced a particularly harsh test. A sudden blizzard swept through, the wind howling through the trees and the cold biting at their faces. Clara had to dig trenches for water runoff, protect the fire, and secure the cabin. She worked tirelessly, using every skill she had learned. Elias assisted, but she could see his quiet pride. She was no longer a girl in need of constant guidance. She was a partner in survival. By the time the storm passed, the forest had transformed. Snow blanketed the ground, the trees glistened, and a quiet stillness settled over the mountains. Clara looked at Elias, and for the first time they shared a moment of unspoken recognition. They had faced the storm together, relying on each other's strengths. The experience forged a deeper connection, a mutual respect that went beyond words. In the days that followed, Clara continued to grow, taking on tasks that had once seemed impossible. She repaired parts of the cabin, learned to hunt small game, and even prepared meals using foraged ingredients. Elias trusted her judgment, asking for her input and allowing her independence. Clara realized that she was not only learning survival skills, but also life lessons: patience, perseverance, and the quiet power of resilience. But it was not only physical strength that changed. Clara's confidence and courage began to influence Elias as well. He, who had lived in solitude for years, began to open his heart. He allowed himself to hope again, to laugh at small things, and to appreciate the companionship that Clara provided. The mountain, which had once been a place of isolation and pain, became a space of growth and healing for both of them. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Elias and Clara sat on a ridge, looking out over the valley. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the wind carried the scent of pine and earth. Clara felt a profound sense of peace. She had come to the mountains as a frightened girl, unsure of her place in the world. Now she was strong, capable, and independent. She had learned to trust herself, to face challenges without fear, and to see beauty in the wildness around her. Elias glanced at her, and for a moment his guard seemed to drop. "You've changed," he said softly. "The girl I met months ago, she would not have made it this far. You are stronger than you know." Clara felt a surge of gratitude. The acknowledgement from Elias, the man she had once feared, was more valuable than any praise she had ever received. That night, as they sat by the fire in the cabin, Clara realized something profound. The mountain had not only taught her survival, but it had also taught her self-respect, resilience, and the importance of trust and companionship. The bond she shared with Elias was no longer one of mere necessity. It had grown into a quiet, unspoken understanding. They were partners, allies, and friends forged by shared struggle and mutual respect. The months of hardship, the long treks through the forest, the blizzards and storms, had all shaped Clara into someone she had never imagined she could become. And in the quiet moments when the forest seemed to hold its breath, she knew that this journey was only the beginning of a new life. A life defined not by fear or judgment, but by courage, strength, and the possibilities that lay ahead. The winter in the mountains had been long, harsh, and unforgiving, but it had shaped Clara Benson in ways she could never have imagined. The girl who had once arrived timid, uncertain, and frightened was now strong, capable, and confident. Her hands bore the marks of hard work, her eyes carried the quiet strength of someone who had faced fear and overcome it, and her heart had learned lessons in courage, resilience, and hope. Elias Monroe watched her often, his sharp, wary eyes softening whenever he saw her tackle a challenge. He had been a man of solitude for many years, living in a world where trust was rare and companionship rarer still. Yet Clara had changed that. Through her determination, her courage, and her quiet strength, she had broken through the walls he had built around himself. Together, they had faced the storms, the blizzards, the treacherous trails, and the harsh realities of survival in the mountains. Now they shared something rare and precious, a bond built on mutual respect and trust. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and bringing the mountains back to life. Streams gurgled cheerfully, trees burst into fresh green, and wildflowers dotted the forest floor. Clara walked along the familiar trails, her movements confident and sure. She paused to listen to the birds, to watch the deer grazing in the distance, and to feel the warmth of the sun on her face. The forest no longer felt intimidating or alien. It had become a home, a place where she had discovered her true self. One morning, Elias handed Clara a small note. "It's time," he said simply. Clara frowned, unsure what he meant. Elias' expression was serious, his eyes reflecting a rare vulnerability. "It's time to return," he explained. "The town, they need to see what you have become. They sent you away in judgment, and now they will have to face the truth." Clara felt a mix of fear and excitement. She had grown comfortable in the mountains, and the thought of returning to Millstone stirred memories of whispers, judgment, and shame. But she also knew she could not hide forever. She had changed, and it was time for the town to recognize the person she had become. The journey back to Millstone was both familiar and strange. The forest seemed different in spring, softer, alive with new life, yet still wild and untamed. Clara moved with ease, her confidence evident in every step. Elias followed closely, silent but vigilant, as they navigated the trails. Clara felt a quiet pride. She had survived the mountains, learned their secrets, and grown stronger than she ever thought possible. Now she would face the people who had cast her aside, not as a timid girl, but as a woman who knew her worth. As they neared the outskirts of Millstone, Clara's heart pounded. The familiar streets, the small bakery, the old church, and the town square came into view. People paused in their daily routines, staring as Clara and Elias approached. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that Clara Benson? She survived. And that's Elias Monroe." Clara held her head high, feeling a surge of courage. She had faced storms in the mountains, had climbed cliffs, survived blizzards, and learned to endure hardship. The judgment of the townspeople could not shake her now. Elias walked beside her, quiet and steady, his presence a source of reassurance. Together they stepped into the town square where a small crowd had gathered. The town's mayor, an older man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "Clara Benson," he said slowly, his voice tinged with surprise. "We did not expect this." Clara met his gaze, her own eyes steady and confident. "You sent me away because you believed I was unfit, unwanted, and incapable," she said clearly, her voice calm but strong. "I have survived, I have grown, and I am no longer the person you judged." The crowd murmured, some faces reflecting shock, others shame, and a few admiration. Clara continued, "I did not do this alone. Elias Monroe guided me, taught me, and trusted me when no one else did. I owe him my strength, and I stand here today not just for myself, but for anyone who has ever been judged unfairly." Elias remained silent, but his eyes met hers, conveying pride and respect. The townspeople began to understand that the girl they had cast away was no longer the same. She was strong, capable, and unafraid to face them. And Elias, once feared and misunderstood, now stood as a quiet testament to the power of guidance, trust, and the lessons learned in the wild. In the days that followed, Clara became a symbol in Millstone. People who had once whispered about her mistakes now approached with curiosity and respect. She shared stories of her life in the mountains, the hardships, the lessons, and the growth. She spoke of survival, patience, and the importance of trusting oneself. Children listened wide-eyed, and even adults found inspiration in her journey. Elias, meanwhile, returned to the forest but not to complete solitude. He occasionally visited the town, quietly observing the changes and offering guidance to those willing to learn. His presence reminded the townspeople that strength could be found in unexpected places, and that even those who appeared distant or harsh had stories worth understanding. Clara and Elias continued their life in harmony, balancing the solitude of the mountains with the life of the town. Clara taught younger women and men survival skills, showing them how to navigate the forest safely, how to respect nature, and how to develop courage in the face of adversity. Elias remained her mentor, her friend, and sometimes her silent partner, guiding without judgment, teaching without ego. Through this shared life, Clara and Elias discovered a deeper connection than either had expected. They did not need constant words or gestures. Their bond was built on understanding, mutual respect, and shared experience. The hardships they had endured together had forged trust and loyalty, stronger than anything Clara had known before. One summer evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Clara and Elias walked along the trail near the cabin. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Birds sang overhead, and the forest seemed to hum with life. Clara looked at Elias, a quiet smile on her face. "I never thought I could come this far," she said softly. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable but gentle. "You have always had the strength, you just needed to see it yourself." Clara realized that this journey had been about more than survival. It had been about discovering her own capabilities, facing fears, and finding courage in unexpected places. And in Elias, she had found a companion who understood the value of resilience, patience, and quiet determination. The town of Millstone had learned a lesson as well. They saw that judgment and gossip could never define a person's true worth. Clara's transformation reminded them that everyone has the potential to grow, change, and rise above hardship. And Elias' presence showed them that even those who choose solitude can offer guidance, wisdom, and inspiration. As the years passed, Clara continued to thrive. She balanced life in the mountains with life in the town, helping those who sought her guidance and living each day with confidence and purpose. Elias remained a steady presence, guiding and supporting, a quiet reminder of the strength found in trust and experience. Clara often thought back to the day she had arrived at the cabin, frightened and uncertain, and she marveled at how much had changed. The girl who had walked timidly into the mountains had grown into a woman of courage, independence, and wisdom. And the man who had once lived in isolation had learned that companionship, trust, and connection could bring a quiet joy he had not known for years. Together, they had faced the storms, the dangers, and the challenges of the mountains. Together, they had discovered the value of trust, respect, and understanding. And together, they had shown a small town that strength is not defined by birth or circumstance, but by courage, perseverance, and the willingness to rise above fear. In the quiet moments, when Clara and Elias sat by the fire or walked along the forest trails, they often reflected on their journey. They understood that life would continue to bring challenges, but they had the tools, the trust, and the strength to face whatever came their way. The mountains had tested them, shaped them, and taught them lessons they would carry forever. And so, the story of Clara Benson and Elias Monroe became one of inspiration, courage, and transformation. A story of a young woman cast aside by her town, who discovered her own strength in the wild, and of a man who had lived alone, learning that trust and connection could bring unexpected rewards. By the end, Clara was no longer the unwanted maiden of Millstone. She was a woman who had faced fear, embraced challenge, and grown beyond anyone's expectations. And Elias, the mountain man who had once lived in solitude, had found in her presence a quiet companionship, a shared understanding, and a renewed sense of purpose. The mountains, once harsh and demanding, had become a place of growth, healing, and hope. And the town of Millstone, once quick to judge, had learned that true strength is revealed in the face of challenge, and that even the most unlikely individuals can inspire change, courage, and respect. In the end, the journey was not just about survival. It was about discovering one's own potential, forming bonds of trust, and proving that even when the world casts you aside, determination, courage, and the right guidance can change everything. Clara and Elias had faced the wilderness and emerged stronger, wiser, and forever changed. A testament to the power of resilience, compassion, and human connection.